Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished panelists and guests, good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to the 2020 Women's Leaders in Global Health Conference panel titled Spotlights to Africa, Embracing Change, Dismantling Gender Discrimination in the Workplace. I'm Dr. Joannie Bewa. I'm the Interim Board Chair for Women in Global Health, a global movement with 24 chapters around the world, all women-led, with nearly half based in LMICs. I'm a family medicine physician with a decade of experience in global health advocacy and consulting across North America and Africa, including in Benin Republic, where I'm originally from. I'm currently a public health research assistant at the University of South Florida College of Public Health in Tampa, Florida, and I focus my research on maternal and social marketing, neuromarketing, and cancer prevention research. I have the honor to serve as your moderator today. As we all know, women are disproportionately impacted by not just the current pandemic, but also our role in the global health workforce has not been always valued. According to the report titled Delivered by Women, Led by Men, a Gender and Equity Analysis of the Global Health and Social Workforce, published by the World Health Organization and the Global Health Workforce Network, Gender Equity Hub, 70% of the health workforce are women, but only 25% hold senior leadership positions. African organizations have made notable progress, resulting in more women becoming CEOs, joining and leading boards, occupying high-level government positions. Yet, women prospects in the workplace are far from equal to men's. And women's increased power may not always equal increased influence decision making. Today, this session Spotlight on Africa will draw on expertise and experiences from eminent speakers in the private sector, media and health community to explore steps that African organizations have taken and must take for a new workplace normal grounded in equality. I have the honor now to introduce our distinguished and eminent speakers. Dr. Ayode Arakija, former Chief Humanitarian Coordinator Nigeria, who is a globally renowned authority on bridging the humanitarian development peace nexus, but also having high-level experience with state and non-state actors. She served with UNFPA, with UNICEF, collaborated as a lead researcher with WHO in designing and coordinating large-scale research, and is also currently a board member within Women Live Health. Welcome, Dr. Alakija. Dr. Joanne Benson, Executive Director, Public Health Partnership, Global Vaccines Public Policy at Merck. She leads Merck's strategic engagement around vaccines policy, including HPV, rotavirus, and more, immunization program, partnership, and funding, in collaboration with WHO, Gavi, UNICEF, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and country government. She has been involved in the development and execution of several partnerships, including through the Merck Gates Botswana Partnership on HIV, the Susan Komen for the Cure, the US PEPFAR, UNAIDS, etc. Welcome, Dr. Benson. Mrs. Sazini Mojapelo is the Managing Executive and Group Head of Corporate Citizen Absa Group. As a tri-sector leader with 17 years experience in government, civil society, and private sector, her expertise lies in the development and execution of strategic plans linked to business development. She served as a CEO and co-founder of Hand in Hand Southern Africa, an NGO with a focus on micro and small business development, focused on youth and women. A Harvard Business School graduate, she holds a double major degree in sociology and industrial psychology, and a master's degree in development study from University of Cape Town. Welcome, Mrs. Mojapelo. Welcome, Mrs. Mojapelo. We are expecting our last speaker, Ms. Kiki Mordi, who will definitely join us in a couple of minutes. But Miss Kiki Morty is a multi-award winning investigative journalist, filmmaker, writer, radio presenter, and advocate for gender equality. She has been very well known because of her 2019 work with BBC Africa Eye, where she uncovered sexual harassment in West Africa schools in an investigative film titled Sex for Grade. So without any other protocol, we will get to business. So the first round of questions I would like to ask, first of all, before we continue, to ask my distinguished speakers and panelists to first mute their mic when they are not speaking and make sure that they unmute their mic when they are ready to speak so that we can avoid any type of echo. We all know that there are growing examples of incredible women playing leading roles in different sectors across Africa. While low and middle income host 83% of the global population, we also know, unfortunately, that only 5% of global health leaders are women from low and middle income countries. During the plenary session, Dr. Senait highlighted the fact that the challenges are even greater for women of color, including women, African women, and the burden that we carried is even higher. So my question to all panelists, starting with Dr. Alakija, can you tell us if you faced any type of discrimination in the workplace, and how can we help shift this narrative within global health organizations to recognize women as key experts? Dr. Alakija, please.
Well, thank you very much, Joannie. It's a pleasure to be here and wonderful to see this conference come to fruition after a year of planning. I'm delighted to meet my fellow panelists. Your question is a very, I giggled as you said it, because have I faced discrimination? I think for starters, we all must say that we have. And I would start off by saying really that global health, we talk about global health in Africa, but global health and international development are intertwined completely and totally. And so, you know, in many ways, we see this as either or, but we are the women here, the women leaders in global health, the women in global health, we are international development if you look at the wider definition of health. So in terms of facing discrimination, I mean, personally, I would say, do you have a year? Or should we just all get together and write a book? Of course I have, as I'm sure we all have. You know, I've faced discrimination as a woman. I've faced discrimination as a Black person. I've faced discrimination across the board. But, you know, what has been important in my life is to try very hard to rise above that. For me, a little anecdote for me is that in my late 20s, when I was working in the Pacific region based in Fiji, I was invited into the office of the chief operations officer of an organization at 10 p.m. at night in order to solidify arrangements for my new contract. He made it very clear that if I came in at 10 p.m. at night, I would get the contract signed, and if I didn't, that the contract would not be signed. In my 40s, 20 odd years later, in Nigeria, where I was working as chief humanitarian coordinator, I was told by the resident coordinator, humanitarian coordinator, that the only reason donors from all over the world, the US, the EU, the UK, Norway, wanted to give hundreds of millions of dollars to Nigeria's humanitarian crisis in response to my advocacy was because they wanted to sleep with me. I mean, he used much more graphic language than that. Yes, I see your eyes grow wide, but we need to confront these difficult issues. I mean, that was only the beginning. You know, his next statement was that he would report me to my husband for being out at night, you know, working with at dinner parties with white men, actually were his exact words. So the weird thing about this was that this was the same organization, which I shall refrain from mentioning, but I might have given it away already, and 20 years difference. That discrimination has not changed. So from when I was in my 20s and, slim and trying to look gorgeous, to when I'm in my 40s and a mother of a 20-year-old myself, 20 years later, I continue to face discrimination. We face discrimination as Black women, not just as women, but there's a separate level of discrimination as, when you come to being an African woman, when people are asking you whether Africans really have the skills and whether within we really have the educational background to be able to compete with those on a global stage. So discrimination is real, it is here. And one of the reasons I'm excited about the women leaders in global health and excited about your organization, Women in Global Health, and these movements is that we have to confront these difficult issues, face on. And in having conversations like this, we begin to address those issues of discrimination.
That is powerful. You highlighted 4 layers of discrimination, and there's definitely more based on your gender, based on your race, based on your country or continent of origin, and even based on whether you have the skills to deliver. And we need to confront racism, sexism, as you said. That's powerful. And I'm sure your personal experience speaks to so many other women and even men who are listening to us at the moment. Dr. Benson?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to participate in this panel. I think Dr. Alakija said a lot of things that, resonate with me and I think resonate with a lot of women. But, we can sit back here and say discrimination, and we know that it exists. But oftentimes it's really difficult to hold up discrimination. And I'll tell you the reason why I say that. You see, no one tells you that you didn't get that position because they think less of your skills and your capabilities or because you're a woman. And I doubt that those making the decisions about who to consider for that top position are necessarily thinking about it. Sometimes it's just, subliminal, it's subconscious. My sense is that, this has been ingrained into the minds of men from a very young age. These men grow up being told women are the weakest sex, and then we suddenly expect them to transform their thinking overnight because they grow up to become men and they're in the workforce. So I will say that while things have improved and continue to improve, we are very far from gender parity in the workforce. Fortunately, I work for a company, MSD, as you know, that understands diversity and inclusion, and that these things are fundamental to our success and core to future innovation. And more importantly, they believe very strongly in creating the space for women and women like me to lead. So these kinds of overt discrimination of women in the workforce are just not tolerated. Having said so, I personally have experienced, some form of aggression, and I call it aggression, not at MSD, but in another organization. I had met with the head of a unit where I was looking, to attain a higher level position. Upon entering his office, thinking we were going to have a conversation about my skills and accomplishments, how could I have thought that? The person in question, he grabbed me, and I can tell you it wasn't a hello, good morning hug. I knew that. So I promptly peeled myself away and said, if he attempted to do it one more time, I would scream out loud. His reaction, he just looked at me and he laughed and he dared me to actually scream. At this point, I knew I wasn't getting the job, so there was no point. So I left immediately. So now you may consider this as a case of sexual harassment, and many people will, but it is more than that. You can't separate what happened, from the fact that I never even got the chance to vie for a position that I knew that I was qualified for. So we can't talk about gender inequality without looking at this kinds of other issues that plague women in the workforce, especially in Africa. Especially so in Africa, where the society and businesses are male-dominated, albeit it is changing. But honestly, I think there's still a long way to go. So to your question about how do we help shift the narrative, I think there are a number of things we can do. We need to first acknowledge that women understand the problems that plague them in their households. That's the first thing. Until women who are in senior leadership positions start demanding that other women are at the decision-making table, honestly, I doubt that we will go very far. Organizations need to be sensitized also to the issues and they need to be held accountable for ensuring that women are represented in not only defining the problem, but that they also are part of the solution. So I believe that it starts with the head of those organizations. It starts with the leaders. If they demand if they make this a priority and they demand that policies and programs are in place to ensure that gender disparity or gender inequality it doesn't happen, others will line up. And so I say all of that to say that there's so many different aspects, so many different facets that we need to look at when we talk about discrimination of women in the workforce if we're going to make any inroads into this. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Benson. I think your recommendation are straight to the point, from having a multi-approach, multifaceted solution to address discrimination and harassment in the workplace, but also calling women in position of power to demand more accountability, but also to use their power to move the line. But also you highlight the fact that we need to raise and educate our boys differently, because the whole patriarchy seems to be ingrained in the mind from the day they are born, to the time that they go to the workplace and even beyond. So raising our boys differently and changing those norms and stereotypes would definitely make the difference, as you highlighted. Thank you. Now I'm moving to Mrs. Mojapelo. Can you kindly unmute yourself?
Well, thank you for that question. And listening to my fellow panelists, the question of discrimination for me, obviously touching on both of what they've said, is not something that starts in the workplace. It actually starts from the time that you are born as a young lady, and more so a young Black lady, in a cultural environment, a traditional environment that already discriminates for you at home. And you will see that discrimination carry throughout your entire life, from your education system into the workplace. It continues. And obviously we have faced discrimination in the workplace, but I think as I chart the journey of young people, as young women, we face discrimination from enrolling into school, enrolling into university, your choice in terms of academic studies. And if we're talking about the health sector, a doctor traditionally seen as a man. And whilst that has changed over time, nurses are women. So when you start looking at leadership in the health sector, it predominantly starts becoming and shaping to become men. And we see that in South Africa. Most CEOs in the hospital industry are men, and only a small percentage are women. The same case for myself. If I think about being a young Black woman, one of the first encounters I had of where it was major discrimination. It was not only targeted at ageism, where an incoming chairman at my previous role said he just wanted to register his concern that I'm a young woman. And I could see that what he was short of saying is that I'm a young Black woman. So not only did I see racism, ageism, gender discrimination. And from that perspective, I was getting ready to have this engagement with the chairman to discuss my role and the importance of what we have been doing over the years, but he needed to register the concern. So short to say, that didn't quite work out well. But I can see now that continues and perpetuates in the workplace, and not only just perpetuates, it's actually accepted that as men, they can say those kind of things to you, not at a professional level, but actually looking at you from a gendered lens. And I think more so the need for us as women in those leadership positions to start confronting that and looking for solutions around that and seeing how we can best challenge it, not from the perspective of dealing with it only at a personal level, but at a policy level, at an institutional level, and speaking out against it. More so the need for us to have that advocacy role in taking your role quite seriously in terms of how you voice those concerns and how you use your voice around the table becomes quite important. But ongoing in my life, I'm in my 40s now, I still face the same ageism that I did, similar to Dr. Ayode, when I was 20-something, to 30-something, to 40-something. I know they say Black women don't crack, but still, it just does seem to continue regardless. And I primarily sit there and think, if I was a man sitting here, the conversation would be different. And I think it's time for us to shift those conversations and particularly voice them and point them out and make sure that we create an uncomfortable environment for you who's saying it and not for me.
That is definitely so inspiring. And I want to piggyback on the whole concept of Black don't crack. And I think all the women on this panel, when you were disclosing your age, I was like, wow, I wish I can be that, fresh and good looking when I'll be in my 40s. So definitely that's a bonus for us. But you also pointed out the whole issue about racism, ageism, and sexism, and how we need to look at the issue, not just from an unilateral approach, but more like an ecological approach where we look at individually, challenging the status quo individually, addressing it through policy change, addressing it through institutional change, but also using our voice and advocate and voicing those concerns. And I think the work that you three are doing the best way to kind of exemplify the way that you are voicing those concerns. I will move to the next round of questions and I will come back to Dr. Alakija. You are very well known to be a fierce activist and then have used your voice, and also professional, and you have used your voice to bring attention to pressing issues affecting African girls and women. In your different roles, what have you learned about speaking up and calling out inequalities and discrimination, especially in the health and development space? Dr. Alakija.
Thank you, Joan. I don't know about being a fierce activist. I would say almost that now I'm a tired activist. And I was actually really looking forward to having Kiki on the panel today, because looking at that next generation coming up really sort of re-energizes one and gives one hope. I spent, as I said, 20 plus years fighting for social justice and equity, not just on the African continent, but across the world. My majority of my experience has been in the Pacific region, the Asia Pacific region. And I mean, what exactly has been my experience and how, what do I see? I think we've already started to talk about confronting issues head on, and how has this worked? It's been difficult. Nobody likes to be challenged. I think, Sazini just said, nobody likes to be challenged. And these things are ingrained, not just in our culture, but in many cultures around the world. I mean, in the UK, in America, where some of you are, these things are ingrained. And so I think if I were to answer in one word, what has the experience been? It's been difficult. And I think this is a sort of safe and a transparent space. And I'm going to say that it's been difficult. It's been painful along the line in many ways, because many times, as Dr. Benson said, you're not meant to complain. You're not meant to, some of it is subtle, some of it is completely overt. And you're not meant to acknowledge the fact that these things are happening. Within our culture in Africa, sometimes people will tell you to be quiet. What's wrong with you? This is how it has been for years. Just, shh, be quiet, keep on with your work. But for those of us who feel like, I cannot be quiet because I have a daughter and I have other, biological daughters and daughters coming behind me. And if I don't fight this now, they will be fighting the same battles. And that is not something I want to see. I don't want to see that the generations coming are fighting the same battles. And so one confronts it, but it is difficult. And there often is a lot of pushback. And as Dr. Benson said, sometimes it affects career path. You walk into a room, you walk into a setting, and you refuse to, as you said, the patriarchy. You refuse to bow to the patriarchy. You stand up to the patriarchy, and there's pushback. Sazini talked about institutions, and Dr. Benson talked about women leadership in institutions. And I'll say to you that I don't actually believe that is enough, because I have personal experience of that oftentimes you find that when women have pushed their way to the top of an institution, the last thing they want to do is to shake the status quo. And this is some of what we need to confront. These are some of the difficult things we need to confront, because they themselves have managed to scrape their way through. And this is why organizations and convenings like this are so important. They've managed to, get their way through to the top. And they're saying, no, 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 don't you come and shake this table that I'm sitting on. You know, let us manage the situation. It's not let us confront the situation. Yes, we can do nice things like the parity, and we can, you know, put people 50%, for instance, in the UN, 50% women at agencies. But what does that actually mean? Beyond a tokenistic representation, is that helping the 30-year-old? Is that helping the 20-year-old? When a Sazini comes to you or Dr. Benson comes to you and says that these are the issues that I've faced, are you going to tell her to be quiet so that we can, you know, not you know, shift the status quo? Or are you going to stand forward, even if it means that you put that position in jeopardy? Because I don't think that this is a little fight that we're fighting. This has gone on for generations and generations. And we have to be prepared to put ourselves on the line so that if you, Joan or Kiki, who are younger than me, come up behind me, I must be prepared to step aside in my professional space to say, you know what? I'm going to take a hit to ensure that, if needs be, to ensure that that next generation comes forward. So it has been difficult. It's very frustrating in many ways for me. And there are times where I've sort of thought, oh my goodness, I want to give up. But we can't give up. We can't give up because of those who are coming behind us. We can't give up because, you know, there's systemic issues of gender, race, you know. I mean, we're talking mainly gender now, but if we talk about race as well, within the global health space, how many women of color are there in the leadership positions? Mostly in those who are there mainly are tokenistic. You get invited to conferences, they want to, let's look for an African. No, we don't need to look for an African because there are Africans all over the place who are way more qualified than some of the men, you know, white males or otherwise, who have been placed there by reason of their gender. The mediocrity that you have to be 5 times better as a Black woman and as an African woman to be than a white man from in a similar position to be considered either for jobs or for research positions or for, you know, international appointments. And that is something that needs to end. So yes, it has been difficult, but I'm a tired activist, but we don't give up. We cannot give up because we have children, we have daughters and sons coming after us that we have to ensure that SDG, the global goal, the number 5 5 that talks about gender equity and the whole concept of generation equity, that it becomes manifest in our lifetimes.
This is extremely powerful. We will not give up. We don't give up, and we will never give up. And you also make some strong point about, let's not just challenge the status quo. Let's shake the status quo. Let's confront it. Let's take bold actions. And, you know, the whole comment about how qualified we are, you know, I think even myself, I face that every day. Every day I wake up, I face that. I have to prove that I'm a qualified family medicine physician, that I'm a qualified researcher, that I'm a qualified global health, you know, consultant. I always have to prove, even though there are millions of proof all over the internet, and there are millions of African women, Black women, and I will be more inclusive, women of color who are out there, who are competent, qualified, sometimes overqualified, and can make the job and can make it done. So definitely there is also the whole perception about our skills, our competency, that we need to make sure that we put on the table in terms of discussing about barrier and about challenge that women of color, but specifically women from Africa, face in the workplace. I will move to Dr. Benson, and I would like to hear about this. You have played and you continue to play a critical role in improving the health outcomes of African women and even globally, women internationally, through your work with Merck. Have you helped Merck take a gender intentional lens to its work? And are there any learning for other women pushing for the same actions in their own workplace? Dr. Benson.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Joannie. And before I respond to that question, I thought it was important for me to pick on something that Dr. Alakija said. because it really ties in with what my response is going to be to your question. I believe that sometimes that women, we can be our own worst enemies sometimes, really. Dr. Alakija made the point that when a woman rises up into a leadership position within an organization, the last thing on her mind is how she's going to, pull up other, women and bring them up that ladder. And sometimes the mindset is, you know what, I struggled to get where I am. I've paid the price, and you think you can get here overnight? And that's the mindset, that other women have to pay the price as well before they can attain those positions of leadership. And I think that as women, if we really want to do ourselves good service, we really need to shift from that mindset and begin to realize that other people pave the way for us as well. And so when you find yourself, for me, this is a charge to other women, that when you find yourself in a position of leadership, that let it be a responsibility to bring one or two people up with you. Let it be a concerted effort that's what you do. So coming to the question that you asked me, and I'll start with a story. Several years ago, I came out of a meeting, not particularly feeling good about the outcome. I was one of 3 women in a room of about 20 men. After the meeting, one of the men came up to me. I guess he saw how miserable I looked after the meeting. And he was trying to be helpful, and he said to me, next time, think like a man. I looked at him, I said, I don't want to think like a man. I'm a woman. I don't want to think like a man. And I was indignant. I said, I just want them to hear me. Afterwards, I went back and I pondered over our conversation, and I realized what he was saying. He was trying to tell me that I needed to speak the language of the men if I wanted to connect with them. And a light bulb went off. I said, that's when I knew that I also needed to help the men learn a different language, learn the language of women, so that we could understand each other and get the job done. Because at the end of the day, we had a common goal, but we were speaking different languages to get to the same thing. My job at that time required me to engage, public health organizations and African governments. And this was the peak of the HIV/AIDS epidemic, and there was a great deal of empathy that was required to do that job. Now, empathy is a soft skill and was clearly not mainstream for strong leaders. So I started to bring that E word into conversations with our leaders, and slowly they began to listen. As I did so, they embraced my softer skill ideas for external engagement and plans. Now, also, when we wanted to embark on a pink ribbon, red ribbon collaboration with the Bush Institute to address the high burden of cervical cancer in sub-Saharan Africa, I had strong support from one of our senior executive leaders, Julie Gerberding, who is also former CDC director, and which speaks to what I was saying earlier on about, support. That support enabled me to push forward with such a novel idea that would ordinarily not have seen the time of day. So fast forward to working with a female colleague in a country where I had been told by male colleagues that people will not take me seriously as a woman, and especially as a Black woman for that matter. So I set out to establish a network of medical and scientific leaders and how to engage them. I helped launch our first vaccine in that country after decades and proved my male colleagues wrong. These are proof points that I could lead as a woman, and also lead in uncertain and challenging circumstances where there is no roadmap, because sometimes there's no roadmap for the things that we do. And I had to lead where I had no authority, but had to lead with influence. So demonstrating these proof points is critically important, but it's not enough. As women, sometimes we think that if I do a great job, someone will notice me and they will elevate me, but that's not true. We know that it's not true. You can work your butt off and nothing happens. So in answer to your question, I leave you with these 4 words, or I say 4 nuggets. For me, it means be prepared as a woman. Have clear proof points of what you've accomplished. Nobody can read your mind. I'll say be vocal, speak up. Let people know what you've accomplished. Men do it all the time. They call it bragging rights. I say be bold. Ask for what you really want. Don't compromise because you think you won't get that role that you want, and so you ask for the next best thing. When presented with an opportunity, a man says yes, and then they figure out how they're going to do it. Women, we start to think about all the additional skills that we want, that we need to acquire before we can say yes. Men don't think that way. And finally, I would say that be supportive, which speaks to the point that, I think Dr. Alakija was trying to make earlier, and which I piggybacked on. Sponsor other women. Where you see gender inequity, speak up. Ask, why don't we have a woman leader in this role? And lastly, I want to leave you with something that my father used to say. He says, if you don't ask, you don't give people an opportunity to say yes. So these are some of the things that I've had to do. Am I there fully? Are we there fully as an organization? No, but we are making strides to make sure that women are valued and that they're empowered to do the job that they have been called to do.
Thanks, Dr. Benson, for sharing those piece of nuggets. I took notes like a kid in high school, because I think those are experiences from your decades, many decades of work and experience. Empathy, you've highlighted empathy, and I think this is something that we still need to have while leading. We were reviewing with Women in Global Health and other partners a speech made by head of states and government during COVID, both men and women, to kind of, understand the type of language that has been used out there. But women leaders had more empathy in the speech, which were more inclusive, looking at social measure for family, while men were more into war rhetoric and more economic related conversation. So, and also not to compare, but those countries that are led by women who showed empathy in the decision-making process cannot have better COVID-19 response and actually response and less negative impact. So I just wanted to highlight the piece about empathy that you mentioned, but also we need to lead with authority. And if we don't have authority at the moment, we can lead with influence. That's my key takeaway from you, Dr. Benson. Mrs. Sazini, Mojapelo, as you know, according to the McKinsey Global Institute, accelerating progress towards parity can help boost African economies by approximately 10% of the collective GDP by 2025. What do you see as the most significant barrier right now to creating more inclusive environment for women in the workplace? Over to you.
Thank you for that question. I think for me, in thinking about issues around gender parity, they also say that it's going to take, it's not going to happen in our lifetime. And I think it's a call to action for all women on this panel and around the world to say, no, it has to happen in our lifetime. We have to shift the scales in our lifetime. But if I look at my work environment in many companies that here in South Africa and in some of the markets that we cover as Absa, the first barrier for me is that when we look at creating an inclusive environment for women to work in, I think the operative word there is inclusive. The companies focus on compliance, meaning that the bare minimum has to be done. It has to be aligned to the labor law. It does not actually look at saying, how do we balance the scales? So if the law stipulates that you need the following, that's the bare minimum that the companies will do. And if we look at, in the context of South Africa, you have to have, we've got our BEE legislation that says X percentage should be women in leadership positions. That's the percentage you'll find in every company. There is very few that will say, actually, let's push that to a 50-50 scale. And I think that's where, from a policy position, from a company policy level, from a government labor law level, we have to start thinking about it from that perspective. And if we institute it at that level, we then will start seeing some form of change in our time. But I think beyond just focusing on the compliance, there are some things that if we look at having a more inclusive environment in the workplace, I'll take from what Dr. Benson was saying, it also looks at empathy. and having women participate and accommodated into that workplace. It's quite recently in the last decades that, if I was to use an extreme example, in the mining sector, that women were actually accommodated in that sector. If you think of women that worked underground and they wanted to use, take a break, where do they have to go? Men could easily relieve themselves, but women had to start going back up and going to relieve themselves. And that, for me, says from an organizational perspective, we need to be thinking about how to create a more inclusive environment. If I think more closer to home, in the urban setting where we work in the companies, where women or mothers who are pregnant have no parking bays. So how do we make sure within the organization that we create that kind of environment that includes women at every level or at every stage of their development, where they can actually find a more inclusive workspace? From a gender parity perspective, I think the challenge that we will always face and creating gender equality in that space is that, for me, the second barrier is that currently in our senior and leadership positions in the corporate environment that we work in, it's still predominantly male. And that one woman sitting around the table, yes, to what the doctor said earlier, is preserving that space and feeling like it was not easy for me to get there. So they actually are not the voice that's representing the majority. So within that space, not only is she minority, but she's also not representing the voice of the rest. So if we start looking at how do we shift that voice, how do we actually start tackling the real issues that we're dealing with when we look at gender parity and trying to create gender equality? Not only are we not represented, but at a corporate South Africa and corporate Africa, we still just deal with the bare minimum. We're at a compliance level, and we're not looking at how we create a policy and enabling environments that deal with a 50-50 split, or even more, 60-40, and see how that balances the scale.
That's incredible. I really like your take about all the organizational change that are required to make sure that women don't have to think twice and three times before having, inclusive environment and opportunities in the workplace. But I also like the fact that you highlight that we need to see more women of color, more African women, both in Africa and in global health, at the ladder, at the top of the pyramid, both in corporate, in philanthropy, in research, and beyond. I also really like, the way you put it. And I think what you're inspiring us to actually summarize here is that the power of minority needs to be strengthened by ensuring that minority become the majority and have more women, more African women, women of color, more Black women on the table, so that we can, strengthen their voice and their aspirations. We will be moving to the second round now, and we'll only have a minute or so for each question, because I've been very flexible to allow our speakers to have more than our 2 minutes, 2 agreed minutes for the first 2 questions. So I will start with Dr. Benson. As you know, you work with Merck, and a couple of my engagement with Merck serving in the board for Merck for Mother showed me and exposed me to the women-centered approach that Merck for Mother, and I also believe Merck as a whole, have been having and is strengthening. You've probably heard some of the other speakers highlighting how mentoring can help strengthen women's centered approach, but also can help women be, out there and lead change from within, but also from outside. So Dr. Benson, can you please tell us how can we develop a culture of mentoring between seasoned leaders in position of power and younger professionals within a minute or so, please?
Thank you. I think, first of all, I do believe in mentorship, but I want to introduce another word, which is sponsorship. Many women are being mentored, fewer are being sponsored. So they're mentored and they keep getting mentored, but they never get to that next level because there's nobody speaking for them in those places of power where the decisions are being made. So first of all, I'd like to say that any woman looking to advance should take the responsibility for their own professional growth. Don't wait for your manager to lead you to the next promotion. They are there to guide you if you indicate your desire. But I can assure you that a silent voice is one guaranteed for stagnation. So to be precise and address the comment that you made about what can we do in terms of mentorship and I would say sponsorship. I want to leave you with these 4 thoughts for a woman leader that a woman leader can do to help other women. Be candid. Be candid about the areas of growth and offer ideas for how that woman can address them. Be kind with your remarks, but don't be politically correct. Being politically correct with that individual doesn't help them because they don't really get what it is that they need. And too many times in our societies, we err on the side of politically correctness. And so people don't really know what it is that they need to change. Secondly, I'll say connect them with others in your network. You may not have all the answers, but you may know others who can. Thirdly, be ready to sponsor them, as I said. Speak up for them when opportunities that you may be aware of come about. I think many people mentor, as I said earlier, they don't go that extra mile to sponsor. To sponsor someone, you have to really take the time to know them and help build them up. Taking time to know someone really just is that, taking time. Lastly, take sponsorship seriously and see it through until something positive happens. We mentor, we sponsor, and then we drop the ball. But if you're serious about sponsorship and mentorship, you will do it until that woman attains a position of authority or a position of leadership that they're aspiring for. And so those are the key nuggets that I would leave you with. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Benson. Let's mentor the young generation. Let's sponsor the young generation until they obtain the position of power, until they have the power to make change, until they challenge the status quo and succeed in their career, said Dr. Benson. Ms. Mojapelo, as you probably heard about, and I'm sure you did, the International Labour Organization, ILO, estimated that the gender pay gap is higher in sub-Saharan Africa, higher than any other region in the world. What are the steps that individual women can take to better advocate for issues like equal pay? Ms. Sazini Mojapelo.
Thanks for that. And I would add to what Dr. Benson said. The fifth one is pay it forward. So once you get sponsored, pay it forward. And I think for me, that was one of the key things that I learned in my journey. Not only was I sponsored and mentored, but the most depressing thing for me was to make sure that I paid forward, and we all should aspire to do that. When we look at the issues around gender pay gap, I think that there's a lot that we need to be focusing on as corporates, as leaders within the space. But I think most, in our context, is women earn 30% less than men. And if we understand how to make sure that we shift their attention to supporting equal pay within the workplace, it's challenging them not only at a policy level, but women in positions of influence need to start thinking about how to shift that and represent and become a voice for the rest of the people, not only from a policy perspective and creating the right policy environment, but challenging the status quo. It's not an easy thing to do, but I think it's something that becomes more important. And we often try and frame it within the context of saying it's prevalent, it happens in our businesses, it's unconscious bias, etc. But I think more and more voices are required, and we need to create a collective within our organizations that starts addressing and challenging that status quo. We certainly have seen the same thing happening where I work, where we have started addressing issues such as that and looking at developing a women's manifesto that directly challenges those issues and making sure that not only is it dealing with it at an age level, at a women's level, but also at a racial level. How do we create and equal the scales from that point of view?
This whole intersectional approach that you just highlighted, not just working from a race, but from a sex, from a gender, but also from an age perspective, I think is really a highlight, the whole intersectional approach that we are all looking for in global health, but also in international development and beyond. Dr. Alakija, we definitely need cross-sectoral partnership, but also most importantly, accountability. To your opinion, how can we organize advocates, but also stakeholders at large and our allies on accountability and cross-sector collaboration?
Thank you. I want to pick up something that Dr. Benson also said earlier about sponsorship. I think that really is a key word going forward as I begin to talk about accountability, because a sponsor, if we go back to what we discussed earlier, a sponsor not only pushes somebody up into that position, but also holds them accountable, but can also hold the organization around them accountable to their responsibilities towards that individual. What we're trying to do is with generation equality, gender equality, is we're trying to shift a systemic. We're trying to shift a system that is broken. We're trying to shift a systemic change, and that is never easy. The partnerships that are needed, the allies that are needed, I believe are at all levels and in all sectors. And primarily, we need to begin to look at how we influence the political sphere. How we, Sazini said something earlier about policy, and we need to start looking at legislature, the legislative arms of all our governments around the world, be it global institutions like the United Nations, be it, governments and, the global south, as it were, where in a continent like Africa, we have less than 10% of women that are represented in parliament. We have I think we've had one or two African presidents across Africa, and everybody thinks that's fantastic. But for a continent where we as women are so predominantly in the forefront of actually making our countries work, it is really painful to see. So I think that, as I look at that question and what are the partnerships and what are the allies that we need to create accountability, we really have to begin to influence in every space. We need, as women, to begin to lean into the political space. This is in terms of global health, because if we don't have the budgets allocated to women within a global health for health or for education, as I said earlier, global health is not just global health; it is development. The whole concept of development on our continent and across the world is tied into that wider definition of health being a state of physical, mental, emotional, and psychological well-being. So if we don't engage with the politicians, engage with the private sector, and great to see that, within this panel, we have that. Engage with CSOs and advocacy groups, and engage with men. Almost most importantly, engage with men, so that, as Dr. Benson said, they understand our language. Yes, they're saying speak their language, but they also need to understand the language of women. They say men are from Mars and women are from Venus. We need to teach Mars to speak Venus, and we need to teach Venus to speak Mars. We cannot stay in our bubble and continue to preach amongst the converted. We cannot just have these conversations amongst ourselves. We have to have them with a wider audience. Even in the planning of this conference, because I was involved in that, we had some difficult discussions about what topics to include, and whether to include the issue of race, which was quite prominent globally in the conference. But then there were those who felt that that might be a bit difficult to confront. If we don't confront it, we're not going to get anything done. And so, how do we hold people accountable? Is number one, by talking to the right people, by having people in those places of influence, by ourselves putting our hands up and saying, you know what, I'm prepared to go forward and influence, be it the government of my country or the African Union in the African instance, or the United Nations. We're prepared to mobilize, we're prepared to advocate, and we're prepared to help be that change that we want to see. But systemic change is not going to come easy. We're trying to shift paradigms, we're trying to shift systems, and we have to know that we need to include the voices of the young people, the ones coming behind us as well, not just to pull them up, but to train them in what not to do, and help them to know that these are the things that we have seen and faced coming up as their seniors, but that this is the way to move it forward. Accountability is key, but it cannot happen until there is a wider understanding and greater advocacy around the issues leading into women's leadership in global health.
Thanks, Dr. Alakija. One of the points you mentioned, I would like to highlight that the whole mobilizing the right actors, but also mobilizing people and campaigning and making sure that cross-sectoral collaboration is at the center. I've seen a lot of organizations such as yours, Women Live Health, and others, Women in Global Health, for example. Women in Global Health launched the COVID 50/50 campaign because we kind of believed in the fact that, women-driven, women country-driven campaign about equal representations of women at all levels is critical. But we also put it out there 5 specific asks to make sure that women are present in global health and security, to make sure that women are visible and those working at the front line are also well known. So definitely accountability, as you said, is critical. Talking to the right partners is definitely key, but you highlight the power of mobilization, the power of campaigning, and the power of making sure that women's working are visible. We have a couple of minutes remaining for the Q&A. So I would like to pick a few questions to make sure that we interact with our audience. We have 4 minutes remaining. So I will pick one question and I will ask our distinguished panelists. Well, I'll pick 2 questions and I will make sure that our 3 distinguished panelists in less than a minute or so address that question. So I will go with this. How does the women of color negotiate or influence her competency in taking on a senior position or equal pay when she is competing with men of similar competency? The floor is open for the panelist or distinguished speaker who would like to take this question. How do women of color negotiate their competency in taking a senior role when they're competing with men of similar competency?
Sorry, you had cut out for a split second, so I couldn't really. I heard only the tail part of the question.
Okay. How can women of color negotiate or influence their competency in taking a senior role when they are competing with men of similar competency? How do they put themselves out there and show that, hey, I can do the job?
Yeah, I think it speaks to one of the things that I said earlier on, that you have to have a portfolio of things that you have done and what you have succeeded at and how you have excelled. We're not very good as women, we're not very good at patting ourselves on the back. And that's one thing that men do very well. So if you're negotiating, a senior role, having those proof points that, I've done this before, I've done it well, I have exceeded in it, and I am able to do it again. And articulating that very clearly, that when somebody, we talk about our elevator speech. And so if you meet a senior leader, that you are able to clearly articulate what you have done, what you're looking for, and what you bring to the table in this role that you are aspiring for. And connecting with those who have gone before you and saying, look, I am interested. Put your name out there, put yourself out there. Don't be bashful about it, be bold.
Thank you. To the other 2 remaining panelists, how can we change the narrative so that we associate quality of grit and resilience to women leaders? 30-second maximum for each of you. Dr. Alakija?
Could you repeat the question, please?
How do we associate quality of grit and resilience with women leaders? In 30 seconds.
I think that was saying to change the narrative. Really, the answer would be very much similar to what Dr. Benson said earlier. We have to put ourselves out there. I don't think there's any doubt that we have resilience. In fact, there might almost be an argument that we are too resilient, because, when you're too resilient, you sort of sit back and you take whatever is, we just keep taking the hits and keep bouncing back and taking the hits and bouncing back without actually pushing back and saying no. So again, I think it comes to that community of advocates around us to ensure that resilience, yes, comes from that community of advocates, but it comes from those sponsors and those mentors and those who have gone before, who are able to say, no, you need to step yourself forward. Grit and determination, I don't think, are problems for us as women leaders in global health. I think we're there already. I think we just need the support. Sazini.
Thanks, Dr. Alakija. Ms. Sazini?
Maybe just to close off, I think maybe just to close off, what I have found to add is to navigate. It's not often what you have put on the table, because we do have the grit, we have the intelligence, we perform, we've got the portfolio, but the navigation with your mentor sponsors and that collective network is what gets the job done. So how to navigate politically, astutely, and understand your environment, and also work at that level with the different people who are sponsoring you and supporting you, it becomes very, very important. But I don't think we lack grit and resilience at all.
Yeah, if I may, Dr. Joannie, I think we talk about things within our respective organizations, but I think it's also important to understand that when it doesn't happen within your organization, don't take it personal. Then just find out what it is that you need. Where are the gaps that you need to? What are the gaps you need to fill, and deal with them. And sometimes you have to move out to move up. If it doesn't happen within your organization, move out. So there are opportunities everywhere. Be open and take advantage of those opportunities, whether it's in your current organization or in another organization. It's not personal.
Move out, and then it may increase your chance to move up. That's powerful. We are unfortunately at the end of this section. I would like to first thank our distinguished panelists, Dr. Alakija, Dr. Benson, and Mrs. Sazini for these outstanding lesson learned, suggestions, but also recommendation. Couple of key takeaways before we end up this session. Women need to raise their voice. We need to make sure that we mentor the young generation. We do sponsor, but also we pay forward. There are a couple of layers of discrimination, from ageism, from racism, sexism, but also underestimating African women and women of color capacity. We need to challenge, we need to shake, we need to break, and we need to confront the status quo. We need to put our money where our priority is, and we need to allocate budget to women's issues, but also budget led by women. Minorities in the workplace needs to be supported and strengthened. We need to engage our allies, including men, but also lead with authority, lead with influence, and lead with empathy. Finally, a cross-sectional approach, an intersectional approach, but also a social ecological approach where we tackle issues from individual, community, interpersonal, policy, and society is critical to address gender discrimination, but also strengthens women's participation in global health. It was a delight to moderate this session, and I hope we will continue this conversation online. Thanks, Women Live Health. Thanks, all the partners. Thanks to the whole conference. And again, let's continue this conversation online. Have a great rest of your day.